Human nature. One of my ex post facto reasonings for the state for a long time was that anti-statists didn't just accept how shitty humans were, that humans are immature and violent and so need a state to keep them in line. Otherwise, people will be at each other's throats. Forget for a moment that the people we know are not like this, but some theoretical other people are, and this is why we need a state. For those other people, me and my neighbors, we get along just fine, but there are these other people, this mass of other people that need to be regulated. An analogy would be that kindergartners need a teacher because they are not mature enough, and if left to themselves, they will attack each other and it'll be chaos. As citizens need a state. Because just as the teacher is wiser than the children to maintain order, the state is wiser than the citizens, and places with the most state are the most orderly. Members of the state are no more capable than those not part of the state, and are often less capable. Conversations with senators and governors and cabinet members are known to create disillusion with the state. To know that behind the pomp, behind the statues and the Pledge of Allegiance and the flag is just about nothing. Upon close examination, the authors of the Constitution weren't all that, and the extent to which they disagreed with each other reveals that none of them had absolute confidence in the Constitution, and that there was not some... and that to the extent that they disagreed is the extent to which falsehoods almost certainly creeped in. So we know that members of the state aren't specially gifted in making decisions about things, and the fact that they don't have to eat what they kill and are instead ushered in through popularity contests suggests that doing a good job is not their prime concern, and we have a lot of first-hand evidence to show that this is not the case. Perhaps the point of the state is to provide a counterweight. We are kept safe through a balance of power. If private citizens attack each other and it gets out of hand, they can just turn to the state. The state is to just sit there, and when things get bad, it'll step in and arbitrate. Checks and balances, so to speak. While inefficient, perhaps the state is able to quickly amass so much force to any problem that it can solve problems that private institutions just can't. So the state's value is in its ability to quickly amass force. And it does this because it has a monopoly on force and can simply command citizens to pay more taxes or it will shoot them. However, the ability to quickly amass tons of force without ever having to work for it directly contradicts the idea that the state acts as a balance, because the monopoly on force results in an almost infinite power imbalance. Well, perhaps the power imbalance isn't so great because we can vote, and so whoever can get the most votes gets to lead the state. And so if a state is becoming tyrannical, then we can just vote in someone else, okay? But then 60% of the population can just vote to fleece the other 40%. Well, this is managed because the state has strict constitutional limits. But wait a minute, the Constitution... No, it does not. The state sucks, and more important to understand is that its suckiness is inherent. Departments are incentivized to grow. They are not incentivized to solve problems, because solving problems does not lead to them growing. Whereas on a market, satisfying the customer, which to the extent that the customer cares about solving problems, is how a company will grow. If the problem of poverty gets solved, then there will no longer need to be a department for welfare. If education gets solved, then there won't need to be nearly as much state spending on education. If there is a welfare crisis and an education crisis, well, that's more reason to spend money on education and welfare. If defense gets solved, then you won't need to spend as much money on defense. Well, whereas if there is a defense crisis, then you will have more money spent on defense. And so the state is incentivized to create crisis. And so state programs are incentivized not to solve problems, but to create them, and then to point to these problems as an excuse for further state expansion. Empirically, we know that the state doesn't solve problems. It doesn't protect us from small attackers, right? And it may or may not protect us from large attackers. It doesn't facilitate internal infrastructure. The Transcontinental Railroad went out of business, and another company was able to build a line from St. Louis to Portland and was able to turn a profit and did it without taking money from the general population. Food production, water treatment, plumbing, electricity, the internet, these are all huge things, and state interferences always make the situation worse. When it manages food production, you get famine. Zimbabwe is a great example of this. Just off the top of my head, I know that when electric companies were regulated, the prices were regulated in California, you ended up with rolling blackouts. And when the state managed trash cleanup in New York, you ended up with trash just not getting cleaned up. I know private firefighters in Tucson work just fine, and typically you end up paying something like $300 a year in Tucson for fire protection, depending on your house. I have no Machiavellian view of human nature. Anyone who says man is inherently good or inherently evil, in general, I mean, obviously we are all individuals. Anyone who says man is inherently good or inherently evil has the burden of proof on them. The only thing we can say empirically is that man responds to incentives. And when you incentivize innovation and providing value, people will innovate and provide value. If you incentivize political action, then people will make investments in politics as opposed to investments in things that provide value to others. Yes, people desire community and don't want a world completely devoid of safety nets. This nearly universal desire is a demand, and this demand is typically supplied today by the state. The demand for community will result in the market providing community. And by market, I just mean people. Because people demand community, people will supply community. Just as people supply food, because people demand food. And whenever the state controls food, it turns to crap. Whenever the state controls community, defense, police, the welfare net, it turns to crap. It's hard to get one's mind around it, but it all boils down to this. If humans are innately virtuous, then they don't need a state. If they're innately corrupt, then they cannot have a state. If they simply respond to incentives, then all a state will do is disincentivize innovation and disincentivize providing value.